There is a specific kind of internal dread, a deep, unsettling horror that washes over you when you wake up and find 30 pastel-colored tints, a folding stage, and a gluten-free donut stand glowing in the middle of your cornfield like some kind of rogue, bohemian invasion. And it hits you different when it's all set up on your private land, without a single soul having asked permission. I rubbed my eyes, squinted through the morning fog, and nearly dropped my coffee when I saw a woman in expensive Lululemon yoga pants trying to lasso one of my prize goats with a silk scarf, while a guy in a pristine golf visor arranged lavender sachets on hay bales like they were VIP seating at a concert. It wasn't a nightmare, though God knows it felt like one. It was a full-on, uninvited HOA, Earth and Harmony wilderness retreat, setting up camp smack in the middle of my back 40. No call, no email, no polite knock. They just showed up and established a whole new civilization. That's when I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was an act of war, waged by people who think reconnecting with nature means disturbing everyone else's peace. My name is Caleb Jones, and I'm a third-generation farmer down here in central Kentucky. I'm the kind of guy who wakes up before the sun, knows every furrow in his fields, talks to his cattle, and fixes his own equipment with a little duct tape and a lot of prayer. I keep to myself, and I don't bother anyone who doesn't bother me, which is precisely why this sudden, aggressive invasion of glamping gear, essential oil diffusers, and HOA rule books wasn't just offensive. It was deeply, fundamentally personal. I drove my beat-up truck down the muddy track to where the chaos was unfolding, expecting a sheepish apology and some quick packing. What I got instead was a clipboard-wielding woman named Veronica Sterling, the president of the Pinnacle Estates HOA, who looked me up and down like I was a mud stain on her yoga mat. "Oh, are you the groundskeeper here?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "We'll need you to move those cows, please. They're interfering with the energy flow in our meditation zone." I should have left. I should have called the sheriff right then and let the professionals handle the madness. But I was raised to be polite, so I explained, calmly, that this wasn't some vacant lot. This was private, actively farmed land, and no one, absolutely no one, had the right to be here. Veronica just smiled that practiced, fake earnest smile like I was a toddler making up stories, and said the field was clearly unused, and they were simply reconnecting with the spirit of the land. When I pointed out the obvious barbed wire fence they had literally cut through and climbed over to get in, she countered with a printout of some obscure zoning map and declared that their HOA granted them an unrestricted right to roam and assemble. That's when two things became painfully clear. First, these people were not just oblivious. They were absolutely, clinically nuts. And second, I wasn't going to get rid of them with simple manners or logic. As I stood there, weighing the merits of calling my lawyer versus just letting the bulls out early, another HOA member walked by carrying a portable compost toilet made of bamboo and PVC pipe, nodding at me like we were old buddies at a block party. In the distance, someone had constructed a makeshift kombucha bar out of salvaged wood and was handing out wellness shots to a group attempting synchronized interpretive dance. My cattle were staring at them with the collective bewildered expression of an alien species encountering something truly baffling. I spent the next hour trying to reason with Veronica and her crew. I explained liability, the insurance nightmare, the fact that there were literal copperhead snakes in that field, but it was like shouting at a grove of overly perfumed trees. They just handed me a brochure titled Harmonic Flow on the Homestead and said they'd be gone in 3 days. I told them they had 3 hours, packed my wrench, and walked away. Veronica had the nerve to give a fake, pitying laugh and say, "Oh, sweetheart, don't be so rigid. We're bringing life to this land." Just then, one of her buddies knocked over a section of my electric fence to string up a hammock. That was the last straw. I called the sheriff. He showed up, took one look at the sheer pastel absurdity, shook his head slowly, and told me he couldn't do much unless I posted proper signage and gave them a formal written warning, claiming that Kentucky trespassing laws get complicated when dealing with community groups who genuinely claim they thought the land was public or abandoned. I sighed, my patience thinning to a wire, and asked him directly, "What would happen, Sheriff, if I ran the manure tanker right through the middle of that field while they were still camping?" He squinted at the tiki torches they'd just lit, then back at me, and gave me a slow, deliberate wink. "Well, "Caleb," he drawled, "as long as you're just fertilizing your crop, who's to say exactly where that spray ends up?" That night, I watched from my barn as the HOA lit dozens of solar lanterns and sang a tone-deaf version of Amazing Grace under the moonlight. I saw someone install a battery-powered projector and start screening a pretentious documentary about the emotional life of moss. They were treating my farm like a rustic, all-inclusive resort, and I was the unwanted, unapproved staff member interrupting their nature fantasy. At one point, Veronica got up and gave a speech about reclaiming earth energy and how modern landowners were hoarding sacred resources. The absolute nerve. My granddad built this farm with his bare hands. My dad ran it through droughts and recessions. And now this woman, who probably thinks a pitchfork is just a fall decoration, was accusing me of hoarding dirt. The next morning sealed their fate. I found they'd rerouted one of my irrigation lines, my expensive irrigation line, to fill their inflatable pool. Yes, they had a blow-up pool in the middle of a muddy field. They also used my barn door as a backdrop for their morning warrior flow yoga class and left eucalyptus-scented candles balanced precariously on hay bales. That was the absolute last straw. Old Betsy, my massive, rusty, beautiful manure tanker, had been sitting idle too long anyway. She was a relic from the days before I upgraded my fertilizing system, but she still ran like a glorious, diesel-fueled champ. I spent the rest of the day tuning her up, checking the high-pressure hoses, and filling her tank to the brim with the finest, most potent blend of fermented cow slurry, silage runoff, and a generous splash of particularly pungent pig slurry for that extra kick. This plan wasn't just about spraying and running. No, these people had turned my land into a festival. So, I was going to give them a finale, a full-circle, farm-to-face experience they would never, ever forget. I waited until sundown. The field was glowing with those obnoxious solar lanterns. A soft-spoken man was reading terribly pretentious poetry through a microphone. They had no idea what was coming. As I climbed onto the tractor seat and revved up old Betsy, I couldn't help but grin. They wanted the country life. They were about to get baptized in it. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. In my experience, it's better warm, slightly steaming, and distributed evenly through a high-pressure sprayer nozzle at about 2 a.m. because if you're going to teach entitled people a lesson, you might as well fertilize your crops while you're at it. Old Betsy groaned to life with a deep, guttural rumble that could wake the dead, or at least the 30 people illegally glamping in my back pasture. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving only the soft, mocking flickers of tiki torches and solar lanterns bobbing like fireflies. From the barn, I could see them all gathered near the center, laughing over some kind of homemade kombucha bar while an acoustic guitar gently twanged in the background. It looked almost peaceful if you ignored the trespassing, the vandalism, and the fact they were treating my livelihood like their personal Pinterest board. My neighbor, Earl, showed up around 10:30 p.m. sharp. Earl is the kind of guy who once fixed a collapsed well using only duct tape, a car jack, and 3 feet of garden hose. He's been my friend since we were kids, and when I told him the plan earlier, he didn't hesitate, just said, "Need me to bring my high-powered spotlight?" He climbed onto the back of the tanker with a grin and a flashlight duct taped to his head. We ran a final systems check, hoses, valves, pressure, then waited for the signal. The signal, in this case, was the start of this silent drum circle meditation, which Veronica had scheduled for exactly 11:45 p.m. According to the laminated itinerary, one of her minions had carelessly dropped near my wellhead. Right on time, I heard the first soft, pretentious beat of hand drums and the gentle whoosh of incense burners being lit. That was our green light. I eased old Betsy into gear, creeping down the slope like a beast of vengeance on tractor tires, sticking close to the tree line. I could hear murmurs, laughter, even a guy singing something about spiritual alignment and the feminine moon. I'd never felt more spiritually misaligned in my life. We circled around behind the tents first, where the portable compost toilets had been set up. No one noticed us there. Everyone was facing the central fire pit where Veronica was, once again, standing on a repurposed wine crate, giving some self-important speech about reclaiming the soul's path. Earl gave me the thumbs up. I turned the valve with a mechanical hiss and a low thrum. The sprayer arm extended outward and began to rotate in a slow, beautiful arc. And then, with a wet, heavy splatter. The first wave of liquid manure burst from the nozzle and arced over the tents like a glorious, steaming fountain of doom. There was a beat of silence, maybe two, before the first high-pitched scream pierced the air. Then, chaos. Tents collapsed instantly under the unexpected weight of the slurry. People ran, slipped, fell, and screamed again. Someone shouted, "It's raining sewage," which technically wasn't accurate. It was fertilizer, but close enough. A woman in a linen robe flailed like a panicked seagull as she tried desperately to drag her essential oil kit out of the blast zone. One guy threw his bag of organic granola at us like it was a hand grenade. Veronica shrieked something about lawsuits and war crimes while ducking behind a tent that immediately crumpled on top of her. I kept old Betsy rolling in wide circles, spraying with ruthless efficiency. Earl stood triumphantly on the back, shouting things like, "Complimentary exfoliation, courtesy of Kentucky's finest cows," and eco-friendly fertilizer, now in human size. It was absurd, disgusting, and undeniably glorious. I had never seen justice served so evenly, in such a thick, rich, brown mist. They tried to run, but the field was slick, dark, and uneven. One by one, they fell, tripping over tent lines, crushed coolers, and each other. A small drone went down somewhere near the yoga mat station, sputtering into the mire. Veronica eventually emerged from the wreckage, screaming for someone to call the authorities, waving her soaked clipboard like it was a holy relic. I turned the tractor just enough to give her a nice, light misting. She shrieked, stumbled, and fell backwards right into one of the compost toilets that had tipped onto its side. Earl gave a crisp salute. We ran a full 3 passes. By the time we parked old Betsy back in the barn, the field looked like a battlefield designed by a very angry cow. Tents were flattened, torches extinguished, and the air smelled overwhelmingly of justice. Earl cracked a cold beer and handed me one. We stood in silence as the sounds of retching, wailing, and general HOA despair echoed in the distance. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The police showed up around 2 a.m. None of the HOA members looked happy to see them. Veronica, trying to wrap herself in a fertilizer-soaked towel, claimed I had violated the Community Assembly Freedom Act, which the officer gently reminded her was not real. I showed the officers my deed, the security camera footage, and the notarized trespass warning I had taped to a tree hours prior. The sheriff looked around, sniffed the air, and said, "Reckon this is the most fertilized campsite in Kentucky history, Hank." Veronica tried to play the victim, trauma, allergies, spiritual violation, but nobody had any sympathy for a group that broke onto private property, held a retreat, and then acted surprised when the farm struck back. By dawn, the field was empty. The only evidence of their little adventure was a pile of broken tents, crushed coolers, and a faint lingering smell of humility. I stood at the edge of the property, sipping coffee, watching the sun rise over my freshly fertilized field. Sure, it would take a few days to clean up the debris, but the land itself would thrive. And more importantly, the message had been delivered loud and clear: you don't mess with a man's farm. Not unless you're ready to deal with the full wrath of his tractor, his tank, and every last cow in the county. It was less than 48 hours after the Great Manure incident when I received the first certified letter. It was thick, pretentious, and smelled vaguely of lavender and entitlement. Inside, Veronica accused me of willful sabotage, psychological harassment, and my personal favorite, emotional terrorism via chemical warfare. She demanded an apology, compensation for her ruined $6,000 artisanal tents, and a public admission in the town newspaper. I read it, laughed so hard I choked on my coffee, and handed it to Earl, who muttered, "If fertilizer is chemical warfare, I've been committing war crimes since '87. A few days later, I was formally served with a notice of civil action. Veronica had actually filed a lawsuit in small claims court. I wasn't laughing anymore. Lawsuits meant lawyers, paperwork, and the possibility of real consequences if a judge got suckered into her theatrics. I met with my lawyer, a brilliant, crusty old bulldog named Clarence, who immediately put my mind at ease. I showed him the security footage, the posted signs, and the sheriff's call log. "This woman's got the nerve of a cat in a dog pound, Hank," he said, "but you're covered. Let's make sure they regret filing this in the first place." While Clarence prepared our ironclad defense, I started doing some digging. Purely out of curiosity, I checked the county property records just to see where Veronica lived. That's when I found something curious. Veronica's vacation cottage, where she stored all her overpriced camping gear, sat right on the border of her neighborhood. A border that, according to an old land survey, had been redrawn incorrectly decades ago. I brought the survey to Clarence. He studied it, then looked up at me with the slow grin of a man who just found a gold nugget in a cow pie. "You know what this means, Caleb?" he said. "That charming little weekend escape of hers, the one with the patio and the outdoor wine fridge, it's built about 30 feet onto your property." I didn't waste a second. We filed a property claim the next morning, backed by the original deed. And just to make it interesting, I had the claim served to her during a special HOA subcommittee meeting. She reportedly fainted straight into a tray of gluten-free cucumber sandwiches. We then filed a temporary injunction, legally blocking her from using that portion of the land. I hired a surveyor to mark the boundary with bright orange stakes, and for good measure, I rented the space out to a local goat yoga company who had been looking for a quiet outdoor location. Within 2 days, Veronica's peaceful patio was filled with bleating goats and middle-aged women in downward dog, giggling as tiny hooves climbed over their backs. Veronica screamed at them from behind the fence, but the instructor just offered her a mat, saying, "We welcome all energies, even hostile ones." Word got around fast. Veronica wasn't just the HOA president anymore. She was the woman who sued a farmer for spraying poop, and then lost her own backyard to goat yoga. The court day arrived. Clarence surgically dismantled her case. No legal permission, documented trespass warnings, and video evidence of her vandalism. The judge cut her off, confirming she had no right to be there, and summarily dismissed the case. Then, he looked at her and gently suggested she consult a zoning attorney about her other property dispute. Veronica declared the judicial system corrupt and stormed out of the courtroom to the sound of Earl clapping very slowly. Back in town, the fallout was swift. Veronica was voted out of the HOA board within a week. Her loyalists jumped ship. The local paper ran a story titled, "Farmers 1, Karens 0. But that wasn't the end. Veronica rebranded as a rural rights activist, hiring a camera crew to make a documentary titled, "Oppressed by the Plow." She tried to sell t-shirts with my face on them, calling me a fertilizer fascist. That's when Earl and I knew we had to control the narrative. We reached out to a friend who ran a viral local gardening blog. In less than a week, she released a video titled, "The HOA That Camped Where Cows Poop, A True Story." It was 15 minutes of glorious storytelling, complete with security cam footage, commentary from Earl, and a slow-motion replay of Veronica falling into the compost toilet set to opera music. It exploded online. Using a shell company, I quietly bought 3 houses within her HOA boundaries. Once I had enough properties, I filed a motion to join the HOA board as a resident and landowner. The bylaws were clear. I had the right. At the next board election, I ran unopposed. My first act as a board member? A motion to eliminate arbitrary fines and mandatory education on property rights. My third, a gentle suggestion that we erect a small bronze statue of a manure sprayer in the center of the neighborhood, as a symbol of standing up to overreach. It didn't pass, but the idea went viral. Veronica eventually moved away, vanishing from public view. Life returned to a new kind of normal. The HOA, while still slightly ridiculous, now operated with actual logic. My farm was safe. My goats were thriving minor celebrities, thanks to their yoga sessions. I eventually retired old Betsy, parking her near the edge of the property, adding a sign that read, "The tank that turned the tide." It became a small roadside attraction, a subtle warning to anyone who thought they could roll up on someone's land and set up shop without permission. Because that's the final lesson. When they come for your peace and your property, you don't have to sink to their level, but you absolutely have to stand your ground. And sometimes, standing your ground requires boots on your feet, friends at your side, and a whole lot of fertilizer.